A growing number of people, Democrats and Republicans and independents, who support the Floyd protests and what they stand for are confused and concerned and in some cases angered that you are picking and choosing how the executive order that you created is being applied. Why are protests with hundreds and thousands of people shoulder to shoulder, some without masks, being allowed, but other small gatherings that affect people's livelihoods and other things like graduations that can be social distanced properly are still not being allowed? You've repeatedly talked for weeks and actually months about how one standard based on science, data, and fact should be applied to our entire state, and yet this seems to be changing for protests. Why doesn't the executive order apply to this situation? And as was referenced previously, you attended a couple of protests over the weekend, so you're violating your own executive order. Doesn't this seem hypocritical when you're asking the entire state to follow everything else that you're saying? But in this case, there's an exception based on your take on it. I think the key here is the logic.
Real quick,
people don't understand the logic of this.
Thank you. Anything else, or is that it?
That's it.
Okay, so I think I've already addressed this. And let me also say that Matt and Pat would want me to remind folks that this is up to local law enforcement in any case. And so I believe it's true, and if it's not true, then I stand corrected, that in any other non-anti-racism protest that I'm aware of that was related to COVID-19 that's occurred, A, there have been very few citations, but B, they've been directed only at the organizers. And so I walked away from Hillside, I walked away from Westfield. I'm going to say a couple of thousand in Hillside, probably more than that in Westfield. Pat, you tell me if you see this differently, or Matt, there's also a decision to be made for public safety locally. How many protests over the weekend?
130.
130. As I say, I repeat my point. This is a moment in time, perhaps unlike any in our nation's history. There is an overwhelming amount of anger and passion, and by the way, it's all been incredibly peaceful. I mean, overwhelmingly so, particularly in New Jersey, and we should be very proud of that. I can't imagine what it would look like if we said to people, actually, you have to stay in. You have to ignore systemic racism. I'm sorry, just ignore it. Just stay inside. You can't go out and voice your anger, your rightful anger. I can't imagine what that looks like as it relates to public safety. And so I would add that dimension to my answer, which is I think this is literally unique in our nation's history. I do think this is an inflection point. I do believe this does feel differently this time. Please God, it does. I mentioned this in Westfield. Let's not ever allow this, like next week, as it's happened so often, to slip into the back pages of the newspaper. I'm the last guy in the state who probably reads the physical newspaper, and it's no longer top of mind. It doesn't feel that way. It feels different this time. It's up to us to make sure that it stays different, and so that's my answer. Thank you. Please, you'll take us out.
Good afternoon. Is it safe to say then that people who attend these protests have some leniency in regards to these social distancing guidelines? And then for the Colonel, you received a letter today from the Assemblyman Jay Weber in regards to his belief that the governor committed 2 separate violations of the executive order. He trusts that you'll uphold your public duty to the fair and consistent enforcement of our laws at this time. That's quoting him. What's your response to his letter? Thank you.
Is that it?
That's all.
I've got nothing else to add on your first question. I've already answered it several times, so you'll forgive me. Pat?
I think the governor's already addressed it with regard to 1, it is a local law enforcement decision, and 2, that for the last 3 months, I think we've been striking that balance between public safety and public health. I think we've seen that every day for the last 3 months, and that's my response to that correspondence.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody. Judy and Tina, thank you as always.